On the morning of May 10th, 2021, Wilanna Bibbs was inside a Davenport, Iowa apartment with someone she once trusted. Within hours, the 20-year-old from Durham, North Carolina, would be dead. The person accused of taking her life was not a stranger. It was Justin Wright, a man she had met while pursuing her dreams in Atlanta, a man she had been in a relationship with, and a man prosecutors would later accuse of deliberately ending her life. But the tragedy surrounding Wilanna Bibbs was not just about one violent moment. It was about everything that happened before it. A young woman who left home chasing opportunity to a relationship that began around shared ambitions, that a move across state lines, and a final confrontation that ended with Wilanna being shot inside a place where she should have been safe. After her death, investigators would uncover a story that raised difficult questions about trust, relationships, and the warning signs people sometimes miss until it is too late. What happened between Wilanna and Justin before that final day? Were there signs that the relationship was becoming dangerous? And how did a young woman who traveled to build a future become the victim of a crime that would leave two communities searching for answers? Because the question surrounding Wilanna Bibbs was not only why she was killed, it was what happened inside that relationship before everything changed. Every crime has a story before the crime. The warnings, the hidden conflicts, the decisions people made, the moments that seemed ordinary until they became impossible to ignore. DarkTrace Crime Stories examines what happened beneath the surface. The relationships, betrayals, choices, and warning signs that reveal how ordinary situations can become deadly. If you are interested in the hidden stories behind real crimes, the relationships that changed, the warnings that were missed, and the moments before tragedy, subscribe to DarkTrace Crime Stories. Every episode goes beyond the headline to uncover the events that happened before the crime ever took place.
Somebody real is hard to find. Somebody worth all your time. Somebody who can tell the truth. Someone who loves you for you. Someone who knows all of your flaws and doesn't impose, try to control them. Let you be free, doesn't deceive. They give you a chance to believe in something.
Wilanna Bibbs was only 20 years old when her life ended. She was from Durham, North Carolina, but she was looking beyond where she grew up. Like many young people chasing a dream, she believed a new city could offer new opportunities. That journey eventually took her to Atlanta, where she became connected to the music scene and met Justin Wright. To the people who loved her, Wilanna was not defined by the circumstances of her death. She was a daughter, a family member, and a young woman still building her future. Her family later described the pain of losing someone who had so much life ahead of her. At 20 years old, Wilanna was still at the beginning of adulthood. She was making choices about her future, building relationships, and trying to create a life away from home. But the person she trusted most would eventually become the person accused of destroying that future. And to understand how that happened, the story has to move back to the relationship that brought Wilanna and Justin together. Because before there was a crime scene, there was a relationship that appeared to begin with shared dreams and possibility. But behind that relationship, another story was developing. Wilanna Bibbs and Justin Wright did not begin their story as two people connected by tragedy. They met during a period when both of them were trying to build something. Wilanna had moved toward Atlanta with hopes of pursuing opportunities connected to music. Justin Wright was also involved in the music world, working as a songwriter and producer. Their shared connection to that environment brought them together. At the beginning, the relationship appeared to represent the kind of future many young couples hope to create. Two people with similar interests, shared ambitions, and a belief that they could move forward together. But over time, the relationship changed. The details of what happened privately between Wilanna and Justin remain limited, and not every disagreement or personal conflict between them has been made public. What is known is that their relationship eventually brought them from Atlanta to Davenport, Iowa. According to prosecutors, the couple had been living together before Wilanna's death. By 2021, they were no longer simply two people who had met through music. They were sharing a home and a life. That detail would become important because the person accused of killing Wilanna was someone who had access to her, knew her routines, and was close enough to be inside her personal space. The relationship also became complicated by the fact that Wilanna was young and far from her original support system in North Carolina. She had left home to pursue opportunity. But the move also meant that the people who knew her best were no longer physically nearby. Her family was hundreds of miles away. The relationship she had built in Atlanta became a major part of her daily life. And when relationships become isolated from outside support, problems that might otherwise be noticed can sometimes remain hidden. However, the public record does not show a long documented history of police calls, restraining orders, or previous criminal complaints involving Wilanna and Justin before the killing. That absence is important. It means the relationship did not leave behind the type of official warning signs that often appear in domestic violence cases. But the absence of public records does not necessarily mean there were no private problems. People close to relationships often see changes before authorities ever become involved. And after Wilanna's death, investigators, prosecutors, and her family were left trying to understand what had been happening behind closed doors. Because the most important question was no longer simply how Wilanna died. It was whether something had been changing long before the final day. And one of the most difficult parts of the case was that the clearest answers could only come from the moments leading up to the crime. Unlike some domestic violence cases, Wilanna Bibbs' story does not contain a long public record of police interventions, repeated arrests, or documented protection orders before her death. There was no clear trail of official reports showing that authorities had repeatedly been called to the relationship. But after violent crime occurs, investigators and families often look back at the smaller details, the moments that seemed insignificant before but appeared different afterward. In Wilanna's case, one of the central issues became the relationship itself. She was a young woman living away from her family, building a life with someone she had met through her ambitions. The people closest to her would later have to confront a painful reality. The person accused of killing her was not someone who appeared suddenly in her life. He was someone she knew, someone she trusted, someone who had been part of the future she was trying to create. That is what makes cases involving intimate relationships so difficult to understand. The danger is not always visible from the outside. A neighbor may not know what happens during private arguments. Friends may only see selected moments. Family members may hear about problems without realizing how serious they have become. In Wilanna's case, the public evidence does not establish every private disagreement, argument, or emotional struggle that may have existed between her and Justin before May 2021. But what became clear after her death was that the relationship had reached a point where a young woman was no longer alive, and the person closest to her was accused of causing it. The warning signs, if they existed, were not obvious enough to stop what happened. And that left investigators with a much more immediate question. What exactly happened inside that apartment on the final day of Wilanna's life? Because the answer would determine whether this was a sudden tragedy, a planned act of violence, or the final moment of problems that had been building long before anyone outside the relationship knew.
Whipping me, he's drugging me, he hacked my Instagram, he was pretending to be me selling the page. This is a screenshot of a post that he posted, and people were actually sending him money just simply thinking that they were buying the page off of me. And on top of that, he left my PayPal balance thousands of dollars negative, not to mention what he did with my credit score and a whole bunch of other stuff. This is how I look like after he strangled me to the point where he permanently damaged my vocal cords to the point where I still can't sing the same. He choked me out so bad I pissed myself, and then he at gunpoint forced me to drink my piss on some R. Kelly stuff, and R. Kelly was a mentor of his when he was younger. This is another picture of what I looked like when I escaped and he was trying to kill me.
On May 10th, 2021, Wilanna Bibbs was inside an apartment in Davenport, Iowa. At some point that day, something happened between Wilanna and Justin Wright that ended with Wilanna being shot. The exact sequence of events inside the home became the central focus of the investigation. What is known is that Wilanna did not die in a random encounter with a stranger. She was killed in a place connected to her personal life by someone prosecutors said knew her and had been part of her world. The apartment was not just a location. It was a place where a relationship had existed, the place where two people had once shared plans and ambitions. And it became the place where investigators would later reconstruct the final moments of Wilanna's life. After the shooting, the case moved quickly from a personal tragedy to a criminal investigation. Police were called to the scene. Evidence began to be collected, and the story surrounding what happened inside that apartment would soon begin to change. Because while investigators were trying to understand how Wilanna died, another question emerged. What would Justin Wright say happened? And would his explanation match the evidence investigators were beginning to uncover? On May 10, 2021, inside a Davenport, Iowa apartment, the relationship between Wilanna Bibbs and Justin Wright reached a devastating end. According to prosecutors, Wright intentionally shot Wilanna inside the home they shared. The shooting was not described as the result of a random encounter or an attack by someone who had broken into the apartment. The person accused of killing her was someone who already had access to her life, someone who knew where she lived, someone who knew her, and someone who had once been connected to the future she was trying to build. The details presented during the investigation and later in court showed that Wilanna suffered a gunshot wound and died inside the apartment. Investigators treated the scene as a homicide. The focus immediately turned toward understanding what happened between the two people inside the home and whether the evidence supported the claim that this was a deliberate act of violence. Prosecutors later argued that the shooting was not accidental. They presented the case as a planned killing, pointing to evidence they said showed Wright had made decisions before and after the shooting that demonstrated intent. The defense, however, challenged aspects of the prosecution's interpretation and argued its own position during trial. As with any criminal case, the accusation alone was not enough. The question for investigators and eventually a jury was whether the evidence proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Justin Wright was responsible for Wilanna's death. What made the case especially painful for Wilanna's family was the setting. She was not killed while walking through an unfamiliar place. She was not attacked by a stranger. Her final moments happened in a place that was supposed to represent safety, inside a home connected to someone she trusted. And after the shooting, the focus shifted from what happened in that apartment to what happened next. Because, in many murder cases, the crime itself is only one part of the story. The decisions made afterward often reveal what a person was trying to hide. After Wilanna Bibbs was killed, investigators began examining not only the shooting itself, but also the actions that followed. The hours after crime can reveal a great deal. Some suspects immediately call for help. Some attempt to escape. Some create explanations designed to change how others understand what happened. In Wilanna's case, prosecutors later argued that Justin Wright's actions after the shooting were evidence of consciousness of guilt. They presented the case as one where Wright did not simply react to a tragic event, but made choices afterward that were intended to avoid responsibility. The investigation focused on the evidence left behind, the timeline of events, and the information investigators gathered after Wilanna's death. The details of those actions became central to the prosecution's argument that the shooting was deliberate. However, understanding the aftermath requires separating what was proven in court from what was only suspected during the investigation. The strongest evidence came from the physical evidence collected by investigators and the testimony presented during trial. That evidence would eventually become the foundation of the case against Wright. But before prosecutors could convince a jury, they first had to answer a critical question. How did investigators move from a shooting inside a private apartment to identifying the person responsible? The answer came through a combination of evidence, interviews, and inconsistencies that began to reshape the story. The case against him was built around evidence that prosecutors later presented at trial, including the circumstances of the shooting and the actions that followed. Investigators also looked at the relationship between Wilanna and Wright because understanding their history was important to understanding motive. The prosecution's position was that this was not a random act of violence, but a deliberate decision made by someone who knew the victim well. Wright was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The case would eventually move from an investigation into a courtroom battle where prosecutors and the defense would present different interpretations of what happened. For Wilanna's family, The investigation was not just about proving who was responsible. It was about understanding why. Why did someone who had been part of Wilanna's life become the person accused of ending it? Why did a relationship that began during a period of hope and ambition end with a murder investigation? And as the case moved toward trial, those questions became the focus of a courtroom where one side argued it was a calculated killing, while the other challenged the state's version of events. At this point in the investigation, the story began changing completely. Wilanna Bibbs was not killed by a stranger. She was killed inside a relationship that had once represented shared dreams and a new beginning. But the biggest question remains. Do you believe this case was the result of warning signs that were overlooked inside a troubled relationship? Or was it a sudden act of violence that nobody around Wilanna could have predicted? Share your thoughts in the comments. For investigators, the case became about evidence. For Wilanna Bibbs' family, it became about losing someone who was supposed to have decades of life ahead of her. Wilanna was only 20 years old. She had left North Carolina with hopes of creating opportunities for herself. She was building a future away from home, and the people who loved her expected to see where that future would lead. Instead, they were forced to return home with questions that would never have an easy answer. Her mother, who later spoke publicly about Wilanna's death, described the pain of losing her daughter and used the tragedy to raise awareness about domestic violence. For families who lose someone through violence, the grief is often complicated. There is the pain of the loss itself, but there are also the unanswered questions. Could something have been noticed earlier? Was there a moment when someone could have intervened? Was there something happening privately that the people around them never knew? Those questions followed Wilanna's family after her death. They were not only mourning the person they lost. They were trying to understand how a relationship that had once appeared connected to hope and ambition ended in tragedy. The impact also extended beyond Wilanna's immediate family. Her death affected the communities connected to both places she had called home. In Durham, North Carolina, she was remembered by people who knew her before she ever left. In Davenport, Iowa, her name became connected to a murder investigation that brought attention to the dangers that can exist inside relationships. But behind the headlines was a family trying to hold on to the memory of who Wilanna was before the crime. Because murder cases often leave behind two separate stories. The first is a story investigators tell through evidence, timelines, and court proceedings. The second is the story families carry forever, the person they knew before tragedy reduced them to a case file. For Wilanna's loved ones, she was not defined by the apartment where she died or the person accused of killing her. She was a young woman with dreams, family, and a future that ended far too soon. And while her family searched for answers, prosecutors prepared to present their own version of what happened inside that apartment. The question before the court would not only be whether Justin Wright was responsible. It would be whether the evidence proved that he made a deliberate choice to take Wilanna's life. The case against Justin Wright eventually moved from the investigation phase into a courtroom battle. Prosecutors argued that Wilanna Bibbs' death was not an accident. They presented the shooting as a deliberate act and argued that the evidence showed Wright was responsible for her murder. The prosecution's case focused on the circumstances surrounding Wilanna's death, the evidence collected during the investigation, and the timeline they said connected Wright to the crime. They argued that the relationship between Wilanna and Wright was important because the person accused of killing her was someone who knew her, had been close to her, and had shared a home with her. The defense challenged the state's interpretation of the evidence and presented its own arguments during the trial. As in every criminal case, the burden remained on prosecutors to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury ultimately accepted the prosecution's case. In April 2023, Justin L. Wright was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Wilanna Bibbs. The conviction brought a legal conclusion to a case that had begun nearly 2 years earlier with a young woman's death inside a Davenport apartment. Wright was later sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence meant that, according to the court's decision, he would spend the rest of his life incarcerated for Wilanna's murder. The verdict answered the legal question of responsibility. But even after a conviction, some questions remain with families forever. A courtroom can determine who is responsible under the law. It cannot return the person who was lost. It cannot give a family the future they imagined. and it cannot fully explain every private moment that existed before the crime. Because beyond the legal outcome, the case still leaves a deeper question. What happened beneath the surface of this relationship before the moment when everything changed? The most difficult part of cases like Wilanna Bibbs is understanding how a person can become a victim of someone they once trusted. Because from the outside, many relationships do not look dangerous until something irreversible happens. People see the beginning. They see two people meeting. They see shared interests. They see plans and possibilities. But they often do not see the private moments where a relationship begins to change. Wilanna's case does not provide a complete public record of every disagreement, every conversation, or every private struggle between her and Justin Wright. There is no way to know every thought, feeling, or decision that existed inside that relationship. But the case does reveal a painful reality. The person accused of killing Wilanna was not a stranger. He was someone who had become part of her life, someone who had shared experiences with her, someone who had been connected to the future she was trying to create. That is one of the most difficult patterns to understand in intimate partner violence cases. The danger often does not come from someone outside the victim's world. It can come from someone who was already inside it. At the same time, it is important not to rewrite the past with information that only became available after the tragedy. A relationship ending in violence does not automatically mean every moment before it contained obvious signs. Sometimes warning signs exist and are missed. Sometimes they are hidden from everyone around the victim. And sometimes the people closest to a situation only understand what they were seeing after the worst possible outcome occurs. The lasting lesson from Wilanna's case is not that every troubled relationship can be predicted. It is that concerns about control, fear, threats, or escalating behavior should never be ignored. The question is not only, how did the crime happen? The deeper question is, what was hidden in plain sight before it happened? Wilanna Bibbs was 20 years old when her life ended. She was a daughter, a loved one, and a young woman who left home believing she could build something meaningful for herself. Her story became a murder case. But before that, she was a person with dreams, relationships, and a future that should have continued. Justin Wright was convicted of her murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The legal system reached its conclusion. But for Wilanna's family, the loss did not end with a verdict. A conviction cannot restore the years she should have had. It cannot erase the pain of losing someone so young. And it cannot answer every question about what happened before the final moment. So the questions surrounding this case remain. Was there a warning sign that, if recognized earlier, could have changed the outcome? Did the people around Wilanna see only the relationship they were shown, while deeper problems remained hidden? And how can families and communities better recognize the signs that someone they love may be in danger? Because every crime leaves behind more than evidence. It leaves behind lessons, warnings, and questions that often arrive too late. Every crime leaves behind more than evidence. It leaves behind warnings, unanswered questions, and lessons that come too late. At DarkTrace Crime Stories, we examine the hidden moments before tragedy, the relationships, decisions, and warning signs that shaped what happened. Subscribe for more stories where the truth goes deeper than the headline.